Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Alfredo Calderon for the record. We're waiting on the speaker, and as we've mentioned, he is in a different time zone. He's in the west coast of the United States, and he might have some issues with the adjustment of the time that happened yesterday morning. Let's go through the housekeeping issues and some other stuff, and then we'll see what happens. So again, please mute your mics. That will allow us to hear clearly whoever is speaking or presenting. Uh, uh, Please close your video. That will allow us to ensure that the bandwidth doesn't impact anybody that has some broadband issues. And if you have any questions, since we're more or less a few, just raise your hand or let us know so we can open the mic so you can speak. Having said that, uh, these live sessions we're having with a guest speaker that will talk in depth about the issue or the module we're covering for that week. And as you have noticed already, after an hour more or less, the session is available within the platform, and between 24 and 48 hours, we upload it to the playlist we have in YouTube and to Facebook, our page we also have available for us, the students. In terms of evaluating the participant, the speaker, we have a link to a survey that we're going to ask you to fill out at the end of the session. Some other announcements. Remember that next week is our last live session for this group. If you are pursuing the certificate of completion, please complete all the quizzes and the checkbox of the participant guidebook by Friday, November the 14th. After Friday, November the 14th, your account will be disabled. So if you find any information, any links, any videos, any ebooks that you wish to have in your personal hard drive, please complete those, download those, they're downloadable. And if you're seeking the certificate, again, complete all the quizzes, and at the end you will get your certificate by email, or you can download it from the course in the last module. And we invite you to have them available, print them out. And the reason is that we're going to have a special event. You'll get the details. The event will be on November the 20th, is the date we're planning, and it will be at 9 o'clock AST, Atlantic Standard Time, or 13 UTC. It's an hour earlier because of the time zone difference, and we want to ensure that most participants that complete the course can participate of that event. Anything else to add, Glenn? Go ahead.
Yeah, on the session, we're going to have a special speaker. Avridore will address the group. Also PIR, Paul Diaz. We'll do a group photo, so that's why we're asking for we'll open up the video so we can do a general snap of the people as well. So we'll be sending out the link to URL in advance to those students who have graduated. As a tool, Moodle allows us to monitor all the students who completed the quizzes, those who received the certificate. So that's what we're inviting those who decided to go through the entire course for the sake of getting a certificate. So we don't expect everyone. We never said it was an obligation for everyone to do it if they choose not to want the certificate or do the quizzes. But this is an opportunity to wrap up in the next couple of weeks any outstanding work that you need to do or review the quizzes. And as we said a second ago, Uh,
Sorry, Glenn, it's me. Go.
Yeah, so take that. So the idea is if you go through the sections and you see a video and you really liked it, make sure you click on it and bookmark it. If you see one of the studies, whether on an ebook, the ebooks, when you click on the ebook, it'll take you to the URL. You can and bookmark the URL as well. So both will be available for you. So we're going to be working in the future on porting the complementary resources into kind of a searchable database format. Right now, we're just continuing to collect resources. So we've shared a couple of times the link to the forum for you to add a resource to the pool. We'll share that again. So again, the resources are growing. Some areas need more, and it'll take some time. So our next group will be starting right after this group is completed. We'll have a roughly a week between this group is officially completed and to the next one starting. So we have a complete group that is starting Group B, and Group C is almost full as well. And we also have the Group D. So if you have anyone that's interested, please go to the website or virtual SIG, and you'll see the registration link for Group C and D for anyone who is interested in registering for the course. So that's basically it. Back to you, Alfredo.
Yes, this week we're supposed to have Bill. He hasn't joined yet. We'll see if he joins in the next couple of minutes. Otherwise, following Glenn's suggestion, we'll go through the slides. We have them, and we can probably have some sort of the exchange of information or a conversation and see if he drops in during the session. Next week, we're going to have Esquire Javier Rua, and he's going to be talking specifically on small islands, internet governance, and legal issues, since he's an expert in that. He has been recently appointed to the country code, what is it, CC,
NSO.
NSO. So he's going to be on the council for that community within ICANN, starting, I guess it's after, well, he's already on it, right, Glenn?
Yeah, he's officially on it because as soon as after the ICANN AGM, we appoint, I was on the NOMCOM this year, so Javier has a long history with Morello, and he was a ALAC member prior to going on to the CCNSO.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, he has a huge background in telecommunications. He was chair of the Latin American Caribbean organization of TLDs and so forth. So he knows his stuff. So it's going to be a really interesting session with him next week. So let's start with Bill's slide deck and see what we can come up with.
Can I read his bio?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay, Bill started his career doing mainstream computer performance analysis and tuning. He's based in California, mostly in the finance and healthcare sector. 15 years ago, he moved over to doing computer network analysis. He's the current COO of his own company, Inside Products Incorporated. He got involved with ICANN. That's how we actually met Bill 5 years ago. And working on the Latin script piece for the IDN, or the Internationalization of Domain Name project. As he stated, several human rights involves communications, involving freedom of speech, of opinion, and the right to be involved with the life of your culture, all of which rather assume that you can do so in your own language. But the internet started monolingual, and its ability to operate in various languages is still a work in progress. Handicapped by a shortage of people from a number of world cultures, here's where we are so far. So in this presentation, Bill has summarized being a member of the IDN group at ICANN. Back to you.
And the internet cover a rather large number of topics, actually. We have the next slide, please. And if you want to get an extensive view of what all is included, you can start with the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But for today, I'm just going to focus on a couple of the ones that involve communication, freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, the right to participate in the cultural life of your community. And all of those really are only meaningful if that communication is possible in a language that you actually know. Next slide, please. Okay, here are a couple of web pages. One of them is, I believe, in Laotian, and I think the other one is in Georgian. The good news is that setting up a web page in a particular script is pretty straightforward. And so that can happen without an enormous amount of effort. The next slide, please. The challenge is, how do you get the web page that you want? Computers, if they want to address something, they will address your system, the desktop that you have in your hand, or the server that has a web page on it, using a number. Computer numbers are in binary, long strings of ones and zeros. But for make it a little bit easier to write, especially shorter to write, the old style of Internet Protocol, version 4, used a series of 4 numbers, each of which was between 0 and 255, which is to say each one was an 8 binary digit number. So you had 32 ones and zeros that would determine the address. And of course, as the internet grew, that turned out to be much too small. So the more recent version of AP of the Internet Protocol uses 8 numbers, each of which is 4 hexadecimal or base 16 numbers. So it's vastly longer. Now, certainly it's possible to remember numbers. Many people will have a dozen 10-digit telephone numbers in their head. And teenagers, at least when I was a teenager, would routinely have several dozen numbers tucked away in their head. But it's still something of a challenge. And also, when you look at an address like this, you have no idea what you're looking at. And just for the record, these are all totally invented numbers. I have no idea what, if anything, they point to. Next slide, please. So as you may recall from our sessions on the history of the internet, back in the 1980s, somebody came up with the idea of having names because they were easier for people to remember. The names are pretty straightforward in structure. The last piece, the original set, .com meant it was a commercial address. .org meant it was a nonprofit. .edu meant it was a educational institution. Back about 2012, the number of top-level domain names got vastly expanded. For instance, .uk means it's something in the United Kingdom. .jp is Japan. .in is India. .de is Deutschland, i.e. Germany. But you will notice one thing about all of these. They're all done using the Latin alphabet. Next slide, please. But of course, there are a couple of dozen other scripts used in the world. And about 10 years ago, ICANN started working on making it possible to do domain names using any of those scripts. It's still very much a work in progress. Initially, we had to start out with each of those figuring out what is the repertoire? What are the symbols that we're going to allow people to use? For a lot of scripts, it's pretty straightforward. If you're in Laos and you want to do something in Laotian, you can go get a grammar school textbook where children are taught the alphabet, and there's your repertoire. Likewise, Georgian, Armenian, Thai, wherever you are, the symbols differ, but children at ages 6 or 7 are being taught all of them, so it's not hard to figure out what they are. Things get a little more complex in East Asia, where you, instead of having an alphabetic script, you have a character-based script. In a character-based script, the number of symbols is substantially larger, and you can go a lifetime and still be learning new symbols. But generally, there's a limited repertoire that you will expect that all literate adults will know. So it takes a little more work for those languages to figure out what the repertoire is, but it can be done. There are lots of languages, and so we had to make some kind of threshold on what languages we would look at. And what we eventually decided was, if a language is an official language, that is a government of a nation or of a state or region or province, does business in that language, then that would be included in our internationalization effort. Also, if something is not an official language, but it's the native language of at least 1 million people, we decided we would include those as well. So as I say, you have a bunch of scripts which are used for a single language, but that's not the end of it. Next slide, please. There are some scripts that are used for a couple of languages, usually as the result of somebody conquering somebody else a few hundred years ago. The Cyrillic alphabet is used for Russian. It's also used for Ukrainian. It's also used for the language in Tajikistan. Those languages are all related, but they're not entirely identical. The Arabic script is used for Arabic and also for Farsi, which is the language in Iran. Those two languages are totally unrelated. The Devannagan script is used for several languages in South Asia. But again, that's a limited number of languages, and typically you can look at a couple of grammar school textbooks and most of the letters are the same. I believe Farsi has 4 additional letters in addition to what Arabic has, because they have 4 sounds that don't get used in Arabic. But it's not a big deal. Next slide, please. Then there's the Latin script. I've been working for the past 5 years on the project that's trying to deal with that one. There are an enormous number. What happened here is, a couple of thousand years ago, as the Roman Empire and the Christian religion spread across Europe, the Latin alphabet went with them, and there were sounds in the local languages that weren't used in Latin, and so they tweaked the alphabet. There are a handful of additional letters that got added, but mostly what they did was add diacritic marks, little dots or lines or little wiggles around the letter in order to indicate that the sound is not quite the same. The letter O might be pronounced O in original Latin, and in German, for instance. So you start out with a couple dozen basic letters, but by the time you've added in all of these, you're up to over 200 symbols. The problem is any given language will use less than a quarter of them and only use 2 or 3 of the diacritics. You also have the problem that because of the way diacritics got added, they are not always extremely dissimilar. And we'll have some examples of that later on. Next slide, please. There is an ongoing problem called DNS abuse, which is basically a matter of someone creating a domain name which is easily mistaken for a different domain name. This is an example of a problem that came up a couple years back where there is a company called EasyJet, which is an airline. And somebody came up and registered a domain name where the J is replaced by an I. Now, you can see that if you're looking really closely, but it's also extremely easy to miss. Domain name abuse can be used to pass on misinformation. It can be used to try and steal personal information. In this case, people were induced to buy airline tickets on EasyJet and give their credit card information, which the people at Easy IET and used to steal a bunch of money from them. Sometimes you have something that looks like DNS abuse and it's just an accident. Do people had say companies with very similar names, especially if it's not a national or international company, but merely you're a local store, and you may have a pub called The Local in your town, and a couple thousand miles away, somebody else may have a pub of the same name, totally unrelated companies, but then it becomes a matter of who got to the registration first. Anyway, next slide, please. There are a number of different kinds of variants. The first one are generic symbols, languages which are totally unrelated, scripts that are totally unrelated, may have a symbol that's a circle or a crescent or just a straight line. This matters because there is, for example, a top-level domain name, which is in the Latin script, OOO, 3 circles. If you want to, you can come up with 3 circles in the Laotian script. You can come up with it in Hebrew, you can come up with it in lots of totally unrelated scripts. So in the course of setting up for internationalized domain names, we had to go through and find out what languages have those symbols, and therefore, if somebody has registered a domain name in one and you want to register something in a different domain, in a different script that looks the same, then you have to, again, do it on a first come, first serve basis. The second set, and you get a lot of this in the Latin script, you get a lot of this in some scripts where shapes came from the same place. And then you get other symbols which merely are similar, even though they're from totally different origins. Next slide, please. This is just some examples of the generic shapes. You can get, as you see, totally unrelated languages where the symbols are similar enough that nobody is going to notice the difference. The crescents are a little bit more challenging because you can have a crescent that opens to the left, like the Latin letter C, or you can have one that opens to the right, which in the Latin script is called an open O. And you can also get them that where the opening is up or down. But you have all of those. Next slide, please. There are 4 related scripts, all of which are descendants of Old Phoenician, 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Armenian and Greek are only used for those 2 languages. Cyrillic, as I mentioned, is used for several languages in the old Soviet Union, and the Latin script is used for languages from all over Western Europe, Africa, also in Vietnam for Vietnamese. But they use a lot of very similar symbols out of Phoenician. So there are, for those languages, even more examples of letters that are similar. Next slide, please. And finally, say you have diacritics, which got invented that are very similar, and you may be able to tell the difference, but if you've never heard of one of them, you may not see it. Spanish, for instance, uses a tilde, which is over the N, which is sort of a wavy line. But there are other languages that use, it's called a macron, which is just a straight line. If you look real closely, yeah, you can probably see that there's a difference between those 2. On the other hand, if it's normal type size and it doesn't occur to you that the other one exists, you'll never notice. You have the same problem with the brev, which is a curved line, versus the charon, which is 2 straight lines meeting at an angle. And finally, you can get something where you have a letter J, and then you have a letter small I with what's called an ogonek, which is a little wiggle below it. The chances are enormously good that you've never encountered the I with an ogonek because it only occurs in Lithuanian. But Lithuanian's an official language, so their I with an ogonek gets included. But that means you have to say if there are 2 domain names, and the only difference is one uses a J and one uses an I with an ogonek, nobody, unless they speak Lithuanian, is going to notice. So you have to block those two domains because they're simply too similar. Next slide, please. Well, we do try to include all of the letters from various languages. There are some symbols that have to be excluded. As you saw on slide 5, the IP version 4 domain number and also normal domain names are punctuated with periods. You have, virtualsig.org. So if a language uses, or a script uses a dot like that, you can't let them use that in the domain name because it looks like punctuation. When the standards were being written for domain names, the thought was, well, let's generalize that a little. So we'll exclude anything that's punctuation, not just a dot, but an exclamation mark, a question mark, quotation marks. There is, however, a problem with that. The folks who were writing those standards were all Europeans and North Americans, as I suspect. And so there are symbols that simply never get used there. When Christianity was spreading around the world and they wanted to write their holy book in the local language, they came across languages that had phonemes that are called stops or clicks. Hawaiian, for instance, is not actually Hawaiian, it's Hawaiian with a stop between the last two I's. The is actually pronounced something like kung, which I'm sure I'm horribly mispronouncing. But the way the Europeans indicated those phonemes was using symbols that they had available on their typewriter keyboard, which is to say apostrophes, exclamation marks, etc. So that's one of the embedded problems in the way the internet is set up, is it was set up by people from a much too small cross-section of the world population, and there were things they simply did not know. At some point, I expect, we will get enough people from Southern Africa, where their clicks are fairly heavily used, and the Pacific Islands, where the glottal stop is used, and they will get involved with the IETF, Internet Engineering Task Force, that writes the standards, and they will rewrite the standard to say, okay, you can't use periods, but you can use things that look like exclamation marks or apostrophes. Maybe some of you will be some of those people who get involved there and make that happen. Okay, that's basically how languages and scripts are being slowly rolled out to be used in domain names. As I say, I've been working on the Latin script, the panel that's putting that together, for 5 years. I think we're going to be ready to go out in another 3 or 4 months for public comment, and then another couple or 3 months after that, we'll finally establish the standard, and those symbols will be available to be used. But it's been an adventure. Okay, that's what I've got. Do we have any questions?
Great, thank you, Bill. I just unmuted my mic.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a couple of questions in the queue on the chat, and I'm going to turn to Alfredo's first question. What organization is charged with verifying if the domain is legitimate or deals with the DNS abuse?
Okay, that's an answer with two parts. For the top level domain names, the .com, .uk, .river, etc., ICANN makes the decisions on what top level domain names will be allowed. As I say, back in 2012, they did a whole bunch of new ones, but only in the Latin alphabet. And I expect once we get the other domain name, the other scripts worked out, so we know what symbols are used, there will be another round of domain names to allow those to be used. For the second level domain names, the virtual SIG or things like that in front of the top level domain name, the decisions are basically taken by the various registries. You have companies called registries, which are make a contract with ICANN to handle registrations for .com or .org or whatever. And it's up to them to decide what scripts they want to use, what restrictions they will put on it. There's a bit of a fight going on right at the moment over how they will deal with variants. The economic incentives for the registries are all on the side of let's let as many similar names be registered as possible, because if you've registered virtual SIG, we can turn .org, we can come along and say to you, well, suppose you have virtual SIG except the one of the I's has been replaced by a dotless I. Well, that could confuse people, so why don't you pay me to register that one as well, just to defend your organization? And there's some argument going on about whether the contracts with those various registries will get modified to require them to automatically block things that are so similar that they can be confused. That's an argument currently going on. But at the moment, it's up to the individual registries what they will allow. So you will occasionally see something that's a string of Chinese characters, .com, for example. Does that cover it?
Yeah, I'm just looking to see if Alfredo has a follow-up comment. Alfredo?
Yes, thank you, Bill, for the comprehensive answer. But I was just wondering, isn't there a sort of a database where different registries from different regions can check to make sure that there's no violation of using those variants that you mentioned?
No. The domain name system itself is set up so that you can try entering a domain name to see if somebody else has registered it. And then you can try and register it and see if the registry bounces it. But if there's a comprehensive database anywhere, I haven't found it. Certainly there isn't as yet a comprehensive database of symbols which are variants of each other. I'm in hopes that ICANN will think about doing that, but at the moment they haven't. The situation is further complicated, of course, by the fact that there isn't a sharp break between what is a variant that nobody can tell the difference and what is so different that it's easy to tell the difference. There are symbols that are what we call confusable. Within ICANN for top-level domains, things that differ only by a variant will get blocked automatically if you try and set one up. But things which are confusables have to get caught by a manual review process. And you can find out that what symbols are confusable basically by going to the documents that each of the various panels for the various scripts has come up with, and they will tell you these things are variants, these things are confusable. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't a database where you can just say, I want to look up and see if this is going to be a problem. It would be a nice to have, but it, as far as I know, does not exist yet. Sorry.
Thank you, Bill. My question is related again back to ICANN. Why has it taken ICANN so long to be proactive on the IDN issue?
Well, there were a couple of things. First off, ICANN only came along about 20 years ago. Before that, domain names were run by a department of the US government, and my fellow citizens, at least the ones who aren't immigrants, tend to be monolingual, and therefore there was no push to get additional symbols. When ICANN came along, I think it took them a few years to figure out that they needed to do something. And it's been a long, slow project. It's not that they didn't start. They started over a decade ago, but first you had to figure out what scripts existed, and you had to recruit people to document what was in the script, and they had to be people who were both knowledgeable and had the time. The Latin generation panel that I'm on has been meeting weekly for 5 years, in addition to which a couple or three times a year, at least until this year, we would get together in person for 2 or 3 days, full day meetings, to try and thrash through the various technical questions. It's you have people with different ideas about how different something needs to be before it's a problem. And the problem is made worse by the fact that after several years of doing this, I, for example, am not a professional linguist, but I know what all 20 diacritic marks that are used in the Latin script are. I've seen all of the couple of hundred symbols, I've been working with them. So I have a much better chance of being able to tell the difference than somebody who merely knows, maybe they're familiar with 2 or 3 languages, so they know they've at least seen half of the diacritics, but the other 10 they've never come across, and they have no idea that there might be something there to be a problem. So it's taken a long time. I see one more question about how somebody can get involved in the process. I would say at this point, as far as the various scripts are concerned, we've got all of them staffed up and people working on them. If you want to get involved in the question about what kind of restrictions ought to be placed on second level domains, for instance, ICANN has people working on it. That particular question has got a paper that is currently out for public comment. So if you go on to the ICANN website and poke around a little bit, you'll find a opportunity for public comment, and you can simply log on and you can read the paper and log on and give your opinion. And I would in fact encourage people to do that when the Latin generation panel's paper on the Latin script comes out for public comment, probably the end of the year or early next year. I hope lots of people will go out and comment. Part of the reason I hope for that is that there are a number of cases of things where I'm in the minority position about whether something ought to be blocked because it's too similar. And if I can get a half dozen other people to come out in public comment and say, what are you people thinking? Obviously, those two are too similar. Then my fellow panel members may rethink their opinions. I will try and get the link to the ICANN page for public comments and get that passed out to everybody so you don't have to spend quite so much time with a search engine trying to find it.
Thank you, Bill. I've opened the mic, Rudy, because I'm getting feedback on my end. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Bill. That was a totally fascinating talk on IDNs. I'm just wondering, are there any limitations on the number and variety of scripts that the root zone can handle?
There are, I think, about 24 different scripts that we've identified because they're used for an official language. We do not, at the moment, use scripts that aren't used in living languages. So you can't do it in Egyptian hieroglyphics because that's not used in a living language. You can't use emojis because that's not a script that's used to write languages. But if something is used to basically to write public documents or to communicate with a government, then that script has been included. I won't swear we haven't missed one, but that was at least the intention.
Okay, so Bill, as a follow-up question, you mentioned uh, living languages, and I was wondering what is the influence that different governments have when in their country, since we're talking about freedom of expression and freedom of opinion, have different dialects. How is that dealt with?
The way we've dealt with it is simply, if is something an official language, that is, the government not only publishes documents in the language or dialect or whatever, and will accept documents on, or accept forms filled out in the language. That's why, for instance, Hawaiian is one of the languages that we look at, because in the American state of Hawaii, you can communicate with the state government using Hawaiian. There are other languages, especially in South America and in Africa, where there are languages which are not an official language. And we basically made a judgment call. We decided to go with the 200 or so languages which have at least 1 million native speakers. There are probably an additional couple of hundred where there may be 900,000, so it barely missed, or there may be 50. Similarly, there's an entire script which somebody invented a couple centuries ago to write the Native American language of Cherokee. But it's not an official language anywhere, and it's not used by a national or state or regional or provincial government, so it didn't get included. It was a judgment call. You can argue about whether it was a correct call, but that's what we came up with. Anything else?
Okay, well, Bill, it's almost top of the hour, so thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting, as Rudy mentioned, and it's a fascinating world of the IDNs and the DNS abuse issues that are going on. So guys, as Glenn mentioned, we will be sharing the links and the document that is open for public comment in the corresponding discussion forum. So look out for it in a couple of minutes after we finish this session. Glenn, do you want to add something? Okay, so Glenn doesn't have anything to add. I just want to remind all of you that we will be closing this cohort or this group by November 14th. Watch out for the invitation to the special event we're going to have on November the 20th, which is going to be through Zoom. And please complete the survey. I'm sorry I can't put up the link right now, but since most of you have it and it's within the course itself, you can go to it and fill it out. Having said that, thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Bill, and we'll finish this session now. Thank you.